Okay. Hello, everyone. So we'll start the restaking DA panel. So let me introduce you to the speakers. So we have on stage Mike, the CEO of EtherFi. We have Nick, the CEO of Celestia. Tarun, the founder of Gauntlet, and Nader is replacing Vyas because he's a bit late, so he might hop on stage in a few minutes. He's the head of DevRel of Eigenlayer. So
Nader's been restaked.
Okay, so we'll start then with the first question. So I would like you, Nick, to maybe give a little bit your perspective about data availability and focus on the difference of what Celestia is offering in terms of data availability versus EigenDA with Eigenlayer. And then maybe Nader, you can also follow up on that to explain to the audience the main differences between both.
I guess I should go since it's most relevant to me. So the question is, what's the difference between different DA layers like Celestia or Ethereum or?
Yeah, exactly.
Others? Yeah, I think, well, there's a few things that are like important when thinking about like different data availability offerings. One is it specifically designed just to do data availability? So one of the differences between Celestia and Ethereum is that Ethereum started out as a fully sort of monolithic chain with execution and smart contracts and state, and so that makes the blockchain a little bit like heavier, and it's not like purpose built to do data availability. They added EAP 4844, which is sort of a sidecar that has like adds a data availability like functionality, whereas Celestia started from scratch and said, if you're going to build a blockchain that was only trying to do data availability, how would you design it? And that sort of resulted in this very minimal chain where you can't do execution or smart contracts on the base layer. All you can do is publish data. And so I think that's one of the big differences. There's a lot more, but I'll stop there and let other people chime in.
So maybe Nader, you can follow up on that and explain the main difference with EigenDA versus Celestia to make sure the audience understands the difference.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that I encourage everyone to, consider all of the different options that are out there and just pick whatever works best for them between all of the different solutions. I'm not the type that's going to shill the product that I work for just because I do that. I would rather them pick the right solution for the thing that they want. A lot of the different characteristics, though, that people do often look at are, price, throughput, things like reserved bandwidth that people may or may not need for their use case. So I would just say, there are different trade-offs between the different networks, different offerings. Look at what you need for your product, choose the right product for the right job, and realize that, I feel like data availability, and I may be curious to hear what Nick thinks about this, is ultimately like starting to become somewhat of a commodity in some sense. And it's also not as tightly coupled to the rest of the system as maybe other pieces are. So you can often even kind of switch depending on how your product is built with different data availability layers in the future if you choose to do that. So that's just my general brain dump.
Tarun, maybe you can share a little bit your perspective as well on this related to, let's say, what will be the type of use cases you feel is more suitable, like for data availability on Celestia versus EigenDA?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing to really think about when you look at the different DA layers is, first, what are the different guarantees they have? For instance, how does one DA layer do reconstruction from light client sampling? How efficiently can it do it? How much bandwidth does it use? The second thing you have to think about, of course, is the duration aspect. Depending on the type of safety guarantees that your rollup wants, you effectively have to think about how long you want your data to persist, how much you want to be thinking about actively bidding. For instance, in Ethereum DA, you have to actually think about how blob space pricing is done in a somewhat different manner than you do in the alt DA layers. Finally, I think there's a sense in which, over time, I think DA layers will just eventually become more complicated, just like the natural evolution of memory within CPUs, right? early CPUs sort of didn't even have a cache. Eventually you had sort of an L1 cache, eventually you had L2 cache, L3 cache, then you split the L1 cache into L1 data and L1 execution. So I think a lot of the natural things you see in the history of computing and the evolution of the history of computing will likely still have to occur. And I think DA is only like the first sort of part of that sequence of new things.
Great, thank you. So for the next topic, I would like to discuss more about the restaking risks and what is the role that, let's say, AVS selection plays into it. So Mike, maybe you can take that one first and kind of focus on, let's say, identifying the restaking risk. How do you think it should be estimated, that risk? How the AVS selection kind of plays a role into it, and how the selection of an eigenlayer node operator that is obviously exposed to multiple AVSs also plays a risk in the overall restaking risk that the end user has.
Sorry, so I'm having a hard time hearing. The echo is totally messing with my, so I think I heard the question. I think it was, how do you estimate restaking risk? How do you select node operators? Was that the gist of it?
Yeah, what is the role of AVS selection?
Right, AVS selection, and yeah, because AVS selection versus operator selection obviously are very different things. I mean, the first thing I'll say, this is maybe really obvious, you can't estimate the risk right now, because none of the AVSs have sorted out their slashing conditions. There's no slashing implemented on eigenlayer, so it's probably not accurate to say there's no risk. But slashing risk is minimal. There's smart contract risk. And as I said, again to repeat, none of the AVSs that I know of have actually figured out their slashing conditions fully. So I don't know how you estimate. You can come up with models, and there's a number of companies, like Authentic is a good example, that are building sort of frameworks for AVSs that allow them to sort of construct. Oh, thank you, whoever fixed the echo. Allowed them to construct more like templatized slashing rules, which will make it easier to characterize the risk. I think it's really naive to think that any time in the near future it's going to be programmatic. The way that, yeah, I guess I'll just talk about how we plan to select AVSs in the near term is going to be very bespoke, hands-on, and working with helpful third parties like Gauntlet to do a deep dive, do a full audit of the AVS, and really understand the details of the risks that are involved, and just make a case-by-case decision. At some point, that's going to turn into a more decentralized governance process. But if I had to guess, I don't think we'll be ready for that for a while, probably for maybe a year. Maybe even longer. So realistically, it's going to be a very kind of hands-on, bespoke process. So maybe I'll say a little bit about node operators. I think we've been just kind of spoiled, but because almost all node operators are pretty good. I mean, you take a look at the top, 30, they're really good. I mean, their slashing is almost non-existent for Ethereum consensus. The experience we've had working with them is that there's a high degree of professionalism, and they're all very technical, sort of sharp teams. My kind of arbitrary estimate is that the risk of node operator error is probably fairly low. I think the risk is more on the AVS implementation side. So I think the risk is probably more on the AVS's slashing rules, hacking, et cetera, than on node operators. I think node operators are generally going to be good. I mean, I can talk more about how we plan to do the risk allocation, and but I think that's another topic we can talk about later.
Okay, great, thank you. That was very insightful. Tarun, maybe you can kind of give us some insights about high level, right? What will be the general risk mitigation framework you think makes sense for, let's say, institutional restaker, right? That wants to, let's say, ask a node operator to, run the nodes, and they want to have some sort of AVS selection. So just like a general framework that you think makes sense on a high level?
Yeah, I think the highest level, 3 things that you should, if you want sort of the three things to keep in mind when thinking about restaking risk. The first is, of course, slashing. That's sort of the obvious one. But the other two are liquidity and duration. So the liquidity risk is effectively, if I have to withdraw, I want raw ETH, I want to do a withdrawal. How long does that take? What's my expected time to withdraw? In sort of different settings, you may have quite a bit of different risk in terms of how easy it is to offer withdrawals to users. Withdrawal is sort of the duration risk is sort of dual to the liquidity risk, in the sense that people who don't want to wait the withdrawal period want some liquidity mechanism, whether it comes from using an LRT, whether it comes from things that are sort of these lending protocols people are building around LRTs, like Ion. And I think there's sort of this natural tension between the three of them. The slashing risk, obviously, is very hard to actually really measure it in some ways right now, even if you had the code for the slashing rules, because a lot of it also depends on the fee streams. If I have an AVS that's earning 1 basis point a block, but you can be slashed 50%, well, then that's a very different type of thing versus an AVS where I'm earning 3 basis points a block and the maximum slash is 1%, right? I can cover it in a few blocks. So I think that this is probably why the slashing risk is the furthest out, but it's also the one that is sort of the scariest. I think the liquidity risk is actually really interesting because the LRTs have already shown you how capital formation is already happening around these, and so monitoring both liquidity risk within sort of lending protocols that are sort of offering leverage, whether they're synthetic leverage like Pendle, or whether it's sort of real hard leverage like Gearbox or Morpho, that effect is actually quite important to monitor, and I think that's sort of where you have to be careful. Yeah, I think if you look at LSTs, one of the dominant advantages for Lido when they started was they had this insane liquidity pool due to kind of the timing of when Lido launched relative to Curve. But also, B, Lido had very good withdrawal semantics. So it was very easy for users to enter and exit. And that part of the UX was really important, but that part of the UX is actually a risk that you have to think about when you're an institution. Because if I am 50% of an AVS, if I cannot sort of withdraw efficiently, then that affects my overall portfolio construction myself. So anyway, those are the three things I would think about, like slashing, liquidity, duration.
So much. VS, welcome here in the panel. So for the next topic, and thank you actually, Tarun, to actually facilitate that transition into liquid restaking and what the risks that it represents for Eigenlayer, but also opportunities. So VS, what is your opinion in terms of liquid restaking, in terms of the risks it represents, the opportunities? So Tarun was just mentioning about the duration and liquidity risk, which obviously it kind of lowers, right, the liquidity and duration risk of restaking to use the LRT. So I guess this is something more on the opportunity side, right, as a benefit, but it also comes with a certain drawback, right, and other risks. So we'll be super glad to have your perspective on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely some complexity to this when it comes to risk management, but there's a misconception that projects that have economic security that's restaked onto their ABS have the equivalent amount of liquidity, and that's not exactly true. And the reality is the majority of these ecosystems are looking to inherit some of this downstream. And we have projects that are actively building liquidity as a service, something like Barachain, for example, which is like actively focused on just incorporating that module. And so it's interesting because LRTs can then enable, again, some of the flexibility that LSTs offered initially to the staking landscape, where your capital is no longer locked and you can have this flexibility to go enter new DeFi positions. And now what's interesting with LRT supporting AVSs is not only can they have this economic security, but then they can also eventually enable some of this liquidity downstream to these ecosystems. So again, Tarun mentioned like risk management, and there's definitely like quite a bit of work that needs to be done in terms of what calculations and estimations of how much security and how much liquidity different types of AVSs need, because that's likely going to be varying based on the use cases. But I think there's some very interesting implementations that could happen.
Since we're talking about liquidity staking, I must ask you, Mike, obviously, what do you think is the impact of LRTs in Eigenlayer's trust marketplace, and how that can somehow influence or change the pricing, right, of basically renting trust? We'll be very glad to get your perspective on this as well. And for instance, like, do you think LRTs are making it actually cheaper, right, for basically protocols to kind of rent trust from Eigenlayer because of the fact they are LRTs and native LRTs, and it reduces the liquidity risk? And how do you think that actually impacts the whole marketplace?
So again, I'll repeat the question. So you're asking how do LRTs impact the price of renting trust by AVSs, other services? They make it a lot cheaper for a number of reasons. For one thing, there is, for all intents and purposes, an infinite amount of ETH available for security. I say that because, for whatever it is now, $14 billion of ETH security available, largely because of the speculative, mania around LRTs and points farming and all that. And there's currently not $14 billion of need for economic security. So there is this mismatch in demand, and because part of the reason that there's so much ETH is because of LRTs, that just naturally is going to, it pretty much empirically has brought the price down to as close to zero without being zero. Most of these deals, the security deals that have been announced by us and others, they're being done at around like 50 basis points. And which is just an arbitrary number. It's like, what's the lowest number above zero that's just even worth doing? So that's the state of the market right now, and that's fine. I don't think anybody, us, probably Eigenlayer, expected this kind of craziness. But I think that dynamic will change. It probably will take a year or two. So I do think this will be a process. In the end, this whole ecosystem only works if there's actual useful economic work happening. Like, AVSs have to have actual customers. It can't just be like an infinite token emissions farm. That can last for a while. The money printer's back on, so sure, that'll last for some amount of time. But at some point, somebody's got to buy something. Somebody's got to do something useful. And as that ramps up, as the need for actual economic security ramps up, then the prices, I think, will adjust. Right now, I guess, again, empirically, practically, what's happening with AVSs is, in my experience, conversation, I don't think anyone's really thinking super deeply about what's the exact right number. Is it 500 million? Is it $1 billion? Is it $2 billion? Everyone's kind of pulling these numbers out of whatever. What they're looking for is a press release and a number that they can go to their potential customers with and say, look, we've got $1 billion of security. Doesn't that sound like a big number? Yeah, that's a big number. Okay, great, you should use our bridge because the other bridges don't have $1 billion. That's actually exactly the right way to do it, because again, the most important thing is these AVSs have to get customers and start doing useful things. And having a big flashy number in a press release is exactly what they need to do that, and so it's the right model. And it's actually perhaps a good thing that there's so much ETH supply that they can basically get this security for effectively free. So it's actually a good way to bootstrap the market, but it'll take time to catch up.
I think those are very good points, that the Eigenlayer points, EtherFi points, and so on, it kind of is it subsidizes, right, also the whole system, and it actually creates like a distortion in the real price, right, of buying trust.
Yeah,
Maybe
100%.
to just end, since we have just 1 minute, Nader, do you think LRTs represent a systemic risk for Eigenlayer?
So we've really thought deeply about this, and I think the best place to kind of learn about all of the research is just to go to our documentation. We have a risks and FAQ. Everything that you would want to know is hopefully outlined there. And then if you have anything else additionally, more specifically, you'd probably reach out to one of us. I don't know if Vias might want to add to that or not.
No, I would definitely defer to most of our research on this. The only thing I would say is there is this current incentivization structure, which is just like stacking forms of yield. And it is a short-term incentive to draw users, but it's not necessarily the long-term incentive or game that we want to play at Eigenlayer. And I think it's really good, like Mike said, to, to some extent, farm marketing from a bunch of sources and be able to bring people on board. But the reality is, downstream, we want to drive fees from these ABSs back to the Ethereum restaking and operator community, and I think that's what it comes down to. So really, both creating ways for ABSs and, if they're an L2, their downstream dApps and partners to be able to bring in users on board, but also, which is a short-term win, but then also, create incentive structures that will create an ecosystem that doesn't necessarily flee as soon as all of this stuff goes live and we're dealing with rapidly exiting users that we're just farming, right? And so making sure that we're playing both a short-term and a long-term win at the same time.
Great. Thank you so much then for being in this panel. It was an honor to moderate this panel with such well-known people in the space, super insightful. So thank you so much, and we'll leave the place for the next panel.